I don't understand why Trump is making these threats. Do you really think that this makes sense? It's typical Trump. He just operates by the seat of his pants, makes all these threats, then backs off. And by the way, if you're the Russians and you're watching this, you have to say to yourself, what does this tell us about dealing with the United States moving forward? Is there any hope for diplomacy? Is there any hope that we can work out some sort of modus vivendi with these people? I think the answer is no. I think if you're the Russians and you're the Indians and you're the Chinese and you're pretty much every other country in the world except for Israel, and you're looking at the United States, you have to say to yourself, this is a rogue actor. This is a rogue state. This is a state that can't be trusted. And you have to assume worst case. You have to plan for that, and you have to act accordingly. This is not in our interest.
No, it's definitely not. And that's with Russia, our geopolitical adversary, if you want to use that terminology, certainly not friend at the moment. But I had lunch yesterday in Washington with a member of the diplomatic corps here, foreign diplomatic corps, who's from a country very friendly to the United States. And this person runs in circles with other diplomats, et cetera. And the guy told me about two particular issues with Japan and South Korea, which were really, really unhappy about how they're being treated by the United States in these trade negotiations, and how they're being coerced and forced into deals that are definitely bad for them. Could be great for us, but it's not a win-win. It's a lose-win. And they are not happy at all about being forced to make these kinds of decisions about either a bad deal or a horrible deal to stick with the tariffs, et cetera. And this person also told me that the Chinese have been whispering more into their ears, kind of along the lines you mentioned about trust. Do you really want to hook your wagon to these guys and stay there long term instead of us? And this person said, well, there's some bad baggage from the Chinese and how we've been treated by them in the past as well. But now we're listening. Do you see any concerns that listening could turn into action later?
Who knows? I'm a structural realist, and I believe structure really matters. And I believe if you're Japan and you're South Korea, the mere fact that you live right next door to China makes China a threat that can never approximate the American threat, because the Pacific Ocean is a huge body of water and we're far away. All of that's to say that from a structural point of view, there are very powerful incentives for the Japanese and the South Koreans to ally with the United States no matter what. But I'm sophisticated enough, at least I hope, to understand that structure has its limits. And one could argue that if the United States continues to misbehave, if President Trump continues to slap our allies around, and here we're talking about the South Koreans and the Japanese, who are two of our most important allies, that at some point they will be forced to work out some sort of accommodation with China, which will be to China's advantage, because China is far more powerful than either one of those countries, or in fact, those two countries combined together. So one could argue that, Trump, Trump made Trump's structure, if you know what I'm saying here, Danny. So I think we have to be very careful. I find it hard to believe that Trump doesn't understand that for purposes of containing China, it's essential to have good relations with South Korea and Japan. And slapping them around the way he does makes absolutely no strategic sense. But he just doesn't seem to care. And by the way, just to take this a step further, the United States is pinned down in the Middle East, and the United States is pinned down in Ukraine. And that has made it very difficult for the United States to fully pivot to East Asia to contain China. You would think, given that situation, the United States would have a deep-seated interest in, if anything, being on better relations than ever with both the South Koreans and the Japanese. But what we see is the exact opposite, as you just described.
Yeah. Well, I don't understand it either. It's my puzzler is not working very well. Okay, I want to shift on over to our primary target here today, and that's with this issue of the frozen conflict. Since I first heard that statement that you made there, and of course you've said it on our show several times, I started really thinking more about it and kind of looking through the landscape here through a different lens through that, because I've always been so focused on what's happening on the ground today and how will the conflict come to an end. And I've spent very little time looking at what happens on the other side of it, however it turns out. And the more I did, the more I'm, I guess, a little bit concerned here, because I see what could appear to be, from a number of different sources, people seem to mentally be preparing for that day already. And let's start off with this was on Fox News, I think yesterday or day before, from former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, who's certainly well tied in with a lot of Republicans. And so not so much what he says here personally, but that he's saying things that a lot of others believe, and that a lot of the things that he says are held as facts by people. And I'm guessing you're going to have a little bit of a difference of opinion on what constitutes a fact.
For some reason, Putin believed that Trump was like Biden or like Obama, that he could push him around, he could lie to him. Much of it's been blatant, where Putin will talk nice in the morning, and that evening they'll bomb, an orphanage or a hospital or a senior citizen home, and somehow we're supposed to be too stupid to realize that we're basically having a Russian dictator who has contempt for us. Well, that's a huge mistake if you do that to Donald Trump, because he's not Obama, he's not Bill Clinton, he's not Joe Biden. And I think what you'll see in the very near future is very dramatic increase in sanctions. And I suspect you're going to see a very significant increase in both the flow of weapons and in targeting accuracy to allow those weapons to be used inside Russia.
So several things I want to pull out here, and let's start with the first one. Putin always lies. I hear that all the time. You can't take anything he says at face value. He lies all the time. And as an example, he tries to reiterate something that Trump has been saying, that in his phone calls with Putin, Putin tells him in the morning with happy voices, everything's going to be great. And then all of a sudden he's bombing, buildings and whatever later on and killing a lot of civilians. But I've seen no evidence that Putin lied about anything, that he just told him, we're not going to have a ceasefire. We are going to keep fighting, but we'd love to talk. How do you see that part about the Putin lies part?
Just building on what you said, Danny, I think you can disagree with Putin's position, but he has been remarkably consistent in his pronouncements and his behavior. He has made it unequivocally clear from the get-go that there will be no ceasefire until there is a peace agreement. And he stipulated what that peace agreement has to look like. And he's made it clear that he's unwilling to bend on what he thinks the main terms of that peace agreement should be. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was telling Trump something different than that. All of the evidence is that he has been telling the same story over and over. So this idea that, Putin is deceptive, he's been leading Trump down the primrose path, making it look like they were going to have an agreement and then welching on the deal at the last moment. This is nonsense. This is the kind of rhetoric we get from Trump, because Trump just tells stories. Facts don't matter to Trump, right? He just, tells stories off the top of his head. And it's to his advantage, he thinks, to portray Putin as the good guy and himself as Putin is the bad guy and himself is the good guy. And that's why we end up in the situation that we're in. We end up having to listen to Newt Gingrich spew this nonsense.
Yeah, and that tails right off Trump's recent claims that 5 or maybe 4 times I thought we had a deal with Putin, and then all of a sudden he does all this other kind of stuff. So that feeds into that narrative, which, as you say, from readouts that happened on the day of the phone call, there's no evidence that anything like that happened. There's no reason that Trump should ever have thought he had a deal, because unless he was ready to agree to the June 14, 2024 lines, that would have been a different situation. No evidence that happened.
That's exactly right, Danny. That hits the nail right on the head. There is no evidence that they were close to a deal. None.
And yet,
one
that goes but then see, that feeds into the narrative that Russia can't be trusted, that they're going to lie all the time. So how do you make a deal with somebody you can't trust? Or in the other part of that comment there, he said, that Russia has not just that they were firing missiles after that phone call, but that they were attacking orphanages, hospitals, and old folks' homes. I mean, he's handpicking the worst of the worst, which, by the way, Zelensky is claiming as well. No military targets, just terror targets. So they're casting Russia first as liars, and then now as basically animals that are just going after old people and kids. What do you say to that?
Look, I've spent a big chunk of my life studying war, and I know a lot about air campaigns. And what people like Trump and Gingrich and others are trying to say is that the Russians are waging a counterpopulation air war. In other words, they're purposely trying to kill large numbers of civilians, much the way we did against Japan and even Germany in World War II. This is simply not true. There's no question that there is collateral damage. Civilians are killed when the Russians attack military targets from the air. But if you examine the targets that the Russians are going after, and you look at the small numbers of civilians who are killed in almost all these attacks, it shows very clearly that this is not a counterpopulation air war. It's designed to take out military targets, not to kill civilians. And in fact, Putin has been criticized inside his own country for not waging the air war aggressively enough. But the fact is, he has limited the air campaign, which is extensive for sure. And again, it does involve killing some civilians in the form of collateral damage, a phrase I hate, by the way, but captures the essence of what's going on. But he's going after military targets.
And there are some, like, for example, overnight, just last night in Kiev, there was like a 9-story apartment building which collapsed and was hit. So it's unclear whether that was a Russian missile that was errant or an air defense missile that missed its target and then hit. And apparently that happens quite a bit of time. Or a third, which I have heard from someone who had direct on the ground experience, that sometimes Ukraine will actually put its military in civilian buildings, etc., thinking that they're safe, or then they'll charge this. I don't know, but here's the thing that we do know, and this was admitted by Jack Keane just earlier this week, which we've had a soundbite on. In his attempt to demonize the Russians, he said over 13,000 civilians have been killed in this war in Ukraine, and this terrorist activity that the Russians are doing, etc. Well, then you look at Gaza, which even by the low official number, somewhere around 60,000 people have been killed. Civilians have been killed in that. Some say it's up over 200,000-300,000. Who knows what the real number is? We won't find that out probably till a long time. But 13,000 compared to 60,000 in a total population of 2 million. Got some rock and roll there. That tells you right there that it's not a target of the Russian military to go after civilians, or that number would be substantially higher after 3.5 years of war.
2 other points, Danny. And of course, I agree with what you say, but a lot of the fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians has taken place inside of cities. And as you know better than I do, when you fight a war inside a city, the defender is going to go into buildings. The defender is going to go into apartment buildings. And the offender, which of course in this case is the Russians, is going to bring a lot of firepower to bear to get at those defenders who are in those apartment buildings. And in the process, civilians are going to be killed. Again, this is the whole point about collateral damage. And the second point I would make is I actually believe that the Ukrainians have ended up killing a substantial number of civilians themselves. And I think this often happens when you have a war between two sides. The defender sometimes ends up killing some of its own people. But the more general point, which is supported by what you said, is that if you look at the everyday reports that are coming out on these air assaults by the Russians, it's actually quite striking how few civilians are killed. I think it's deeply regrettable that any civilians are killed, and I don't want to make light of that fact. But you will read the Russians launched this major attack and Ukraine is saying 13 civilians were killed. Well, if 13 civilians were killed, you can't say this is the equivalent of Hamburg or Dresden or Tokyo in March of 1945. It's nothing like that, right? This is a bombing campaign that's aimed at military targets.
And that's, yeah, I mean, we see that's what turns out when we look at the actual evidence. One last thing I want to highlight from that Newt Gingrich comment there, because I think it's also something that we get wrong in a different direction, and that is overstating what we can do. Because he ended that by saying, I think what you're about to see on the 9th of November is a substantial waylaying of sanctions, that this time it's going to have a big impact, and that there's going to be even more armor and weapons and other kind of things given, which he's implying is going to somehow change the fortunes on the ground. But gracious, I don't know how anyone could think that any kind of pittance that Trump can throw now after what's been given over the last 3.5 years cumulatively by the United States and NATO countries, which have not had any impact on the battlefield. Why do people still have this idea that a little bit by Trump now will do what none of the mountain of stuff has done before?
Who knows? I mean, you listen to Gingrich talk and you just sort of wonder what universe is this guy operating in. I mean, the fact is we don't have a substantial amount of weaponry to give the Ukrainians. Pure and simple. This has been a problem that's been talked about for months now. The weaponry is just not there to give them. It's not like Trump has all of this weaponry sitting on the shelf and all he has to do is reach up and grab it and ship it off to the Ukrainians, and in the process get our European allies to pay for it, and we all live happily ever after. I mean, this is nonsense. We don't have the weaponry. And furthermore, as you and I have talked about before, at this point, it appears that the biggest problem that the Ukrainians face is actually not weaponry. It's not to say weaponry isn't a huge problem, but the biggest problem they face is manpower. And we can't solve that problem. And then you get to all this talk about secondary sanctions. I mean, we've said a few words about that. If secondary sanctions really were an effective tool, the Biden administration, which was deeply committed to winning this war against Russia, would have used them. They didn't, and they didn't use them because they're not going to work. And Trump can talk all he wants about using secondary sanctions, as can Gingrich, but I don't believe that Trump is going to use those secondary sanctions. And if he does, it would be a remarkably foolish move on his part.
Yeah, and which still wouldn't have any impact on the ground. Although that does make me wonder what Trump has in mind, because he made a big to-do yesterday on Air Force One of saying the deadline will be in 10 days from today. And you'll see, and you see Gingrich there, I think you're going to see something big. Well, if nothing big materializes, well, I almost said people will start to ask him questions, but I think that he's immune to that. So there may not be anything. Moving on to your Senator John Kennedy. He went on the Senate floor recently to talk about what fair-minded Americans actually think.
I think most fair-minded people can agree on two things. Number one, Vladimir Putin, who runs Russia, not the people of Russia, but their leadership, is a thug. He's a pirate. He has blood under his fingernails. He can't be trusted. I think Ukraine is willing to negotiate a reasonable settlement, but it takes two to tango, and we're not going to have a settlement until President Putin decides it is in his best interest to stop the war. Not Russia's best interest, because I don't think he cares about his people. I think the war will stop when Putin thinks it's in his best interest. And I don't think he's going to think it's in his best interest until he feels the pressure, Mr. President. Because dealing with Putin is like dealing with most tyrants. It's like hand feeding a shark. Okay, you can't reason with them.
Okay, so you see again the demonization of Russia. The leader is a tyrant, a pirate, has blood under his fingernails, can't be trusted. There's that thing again. So you can't ever listen to him, and only when you force him by compulsory actions are you going to get him to do anything. So to me, this is just setting up post this war, this mentality, and it seems like they're reinforcing a lot of these same themes, that Russia is just this evil actor with no reasonable positions at all. So they have to be gone after. We have to push back on them. How do you see that developing?
I agree 100%. I mean, the Russophobia in the West, and this includes, of course, the United States, is off the charts. And this is just evidence of that phenomenon. And I would say to you, sort of building on what you've said up to now, that it's hard to imagine when we are finally defeated in Ukraine, when this war shuts down, the shooting stops, and you have a frozen conflict, that the American foreign policy elite is going to accept its defeat and move on. We're not going to accept defeat. We're going to continue to do what we can to undermine Russia's position in the territories that it has acquired from Ukraine and in Eastern Europe more generally. We are going to have, in all likelihood, a very antagonistic relationship with Russia for the foreseeable future. And when you listen to people like Newt Gingrich and Senator Kennedy speak, there's just lots of evidence there that that's where we're headed.